Do what?
Good morning, Chris. Good morning.
Oh, well.
How's the grip? That's it. Did you really? Yeah, must be good shot. I used to travel around. Every weekend I was going somewhere. I was the official president. I mean,
I'm still stiff, but I've got to learn how to work.
somewhere.
Yeah, I've
I
never.
get calls Tuesday. So it's gonna be at camp.
That's all that
I didn't come around your house. We could. Yeah. Get everything straightened up and everything. Hello. The back. Come back there. Nothing wrong with that. Hey, kids got a lot of room.
Sunday.
They have work. I use it every day. It's good. It's good. Sometimes we get all these containers, different sizes, 1 gallon, 5 gallon. So, we knock them down, you know. Well, I'm a NGO. We still have
Morning, Stacy.
That's good. Give me a microwave and a fork and a plate. That's all I need. They get it for can openers, I open can beans.
I'm not really excited. My sister's 88, my brother's 86. Yeah.
Have a good one, brother.
I think we get to. You're not 75.
Problem is if you don't have music, we never have a show. So I just it's like one of those portable Yes. Yes, they can.
It's good to see everyone this morning. Let's open our Bibles to Matthew chapter 4. We'll be finishing up this chapter this morning and hopefully getting into chapter 5 a little bit as class goes on. As we begin, Bob, could you lead us in an opening prayer?
Almighty God, our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy matchless name. Father, we're so grateful that we've been able to freely assemble here today without fear. And we know that it's from your kindness that this occurs. We ask you to bless the teachers of the hour that they might remember the lessons they prepared. Be with each one of us as students, that we might be active listeners, that we might learn your word so that we can live your word and share your word. This we do pray in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. So we just came out of our study on Wednesday talking about what we were reading near the end of chapter 4 with with the disciples being called, and how we looked at a lot of cross references and in John and in Luke as well, that kind of gave us some more details about how those first disciples ended up following Jesus and how they came into a relationship with him. And I think that was a good study. There were some good things that I got out of it that I hadn't really thought of before. I thought the points that we looked at about how disciples were made back then with the very first ones, the same way they're made today, right? By introducing them to Jesus. We saw that happening with Andrew and Peter, and how basically telling somebody about Jesus, and then even though they were there with Jesus, they still share kind of a similar experience that we do today in coming to believe Jesus, and that's in recognizing that he is God's son, that he is God, that he is deity, and that he has authority and power. And they saw that through the miracles. We see that today through reading about the miracles that they experienced, and that other Christians experience as well. And those were all really good points, and it kind of leading us to where we are now in Matthew chapter 4. And I'd like us, as we close out this chapter, let's just go ahead and begin by reading verses 23 through 25. And then we'll kind of close out our study and discussing these verses here in chapter 4. Mom, could you read those verses for us? Chapter 4, 23 through the end of the chapter.
And Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all manner of sickness and all manner of disease among the people. And his fame went throughout all Syria. And they brought to him all sick people that were taken with divers diseases and torments, and those which were possessed with devils, and those which were lunatic, and those that had the palsy, and he healed them. And there followed him great multitudes of people from Galilee, and from Decapolis, and from Jerusalem, and from Judea, and from beyond Jordan. Okay, so we read about Jesus' continuing ministry now as he goes out and he begins his teaching. And what did we learn earlier in chapter 4? Where did he start his ministry? It was a fulfillment of prophecy.
Well, after he was tempted of the devil,
Mm-hmm.
we read about. After that, he started his ministry.
Right. We see that he moved. We looked at back in verses 12 through 17 that he moved to Capernaum. And we talked about where that was in relation to the Sea of Galilee, and that it was a prophecy of what was spoken of by Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 9. And that's where he began to preach his message of this kingdom that we've been looking at these last few weeks. But was he kind of a located preacher like we have now, like Chris is to us?
No.
Was that the kind of ministry he had? No, he wasn't a located his ministry wasn't like focused on just one location. And we kind of see that as we go through it. And we're going to see that as we continue to study Matthew, that he didn't stay in one place. There wasn't a place you could go that you knew Jesus would be preaching that next week. His ministry was kind of like a traveling one. It was one that moved from place to place. And so what would people have to do if they wanted to hear him preach more than once? They have to follow him, right? And that's what we see as we read through this account now, and as we continue to read through Matthew, that the people were interested in what he was saying would follow him. And so we kind of have this summary of that going on here in these last few verses. And we read about that and there in verse 23 that he went about all Galilee, and that he went about teaching in their synagogues there in verse 23 as well. And And there are examples of this recorded in other places, which we won't read just for the sake of time. But this is very much a summary of what was happening at that time. You know, we go to passages like Luke chapter 4, and we have large sections of that chapter that give us an account of what he would teach when he was in the synagogues and the kinds of things they were studying. But as we see here and as we read about in Mark chapter 1, let's go ahead and turn there just for a brief description of this. But he would spend time in a place, but then he would be compelled to move on and to continue to move on to new places and new people. So Mark chapter 1, let's read verses 35 through 39. And Carl, could you read that for us?
And in the morning, rising up a great while before day, he went out and departed into a solitary place, and there prayed. And Simon and they that were with him followed after him. And when they had found him, they said unto him, All men seek for thee. And he said unto them, Let us go into the next towns, that I may preach there also. For therefore came I forth. And he preached in their synagogue throughout all Galilee and cast out devils.
All right, so his disciples had this concern that there are all these people that are wanting to see you, right? Which is a good thing. Like his ministry was popular, kind of like we read John's was, right? That people were coming from all around to hear what he had to say and to learn from him. And we see that same kind of reaction to Jesus's ministry now. But what is his response when he hears that everybody is looking for him?
He prayed.
What was that?
He prayed.
Well, he was out there praying, but his response to them was, Chuck, did you?
Moved to another location and preach.
Yeah, that it was time for him to go and to leave and to carry on to the next town. Did you have something else, Mom?
And that was his purpose. That's why he came forth.
Right, and I can't remember exactly how Carl's read, but in the English Standard Version it says, "For that is why I came out." Right, that was his purpose, was to go around and not just stay in one place, even though people all around were coming to him, but actually to travel and to go around in all these different cities, these different synagogues, as he would continue spreading this good news about the kingdom. And just quickly, I'll read a passage out of Luke 1 as well, just verses 32 and 33. It says that he will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. Did I have the wrong verse there? May have had the wrong chapter, maybe. But we see this in multiple gospels. It was another account of him. Or actually, was I in the wrong? I may have been in the wrong. It was supposed to be in Luke 4. Yeah, I'm sorry. Luke 4, 42 through 44. Just looking at the wrong place in my notes. It says, and when it was day, he departed and went into a desolate place, and the people sought him and came to him, and would have kept him from leaving them. But he said to them, I must preach the good news of the kingdom of God to the other towns as well, for I was sent for this purpose. All right, so we kind of see that same message being reiterated here. That he wasn't staying in one place long. He kept moving to bring this news to other towns. And he was preaching this good news about the kingdom. We talked about that a bit in our previous classes. And you know, as we see mostly in Mark, as far as the details of some of that goes, it included the good news about the kingdom was the time of it being fulfilled, right? Of that kingdom coming as was prophesied. The good news is that it's here. It's like it's right now. It's in your midst. It's something that is beginning right now. So that the timing was right, that the kingdom of God is at hand, and I think that's what the Luke 1 passage that we read a little bit of just a moment ago by mistake was talking about, fulfilling prophecy that we read back in Daniel chapter 2. And there's always going to be these references in Matthew referring back to the prophecies being fulfilled, because that was the purpose of this book, as we've tried to keep reminding ourselves we're looking through this about why it's written in a certain way, why it focuses on certain things, is because it's convincing primarily the Jews that what was happening was fulfillment of prophecy, that this is what they've been waiting for. And even then, it was a hard sell for a lot of them, right? Many believed, but many didn't as well, and they had a hard time seeing it. So that's why it's kind of repeated over and over again as we go throughout here. It was an important part of Jesus' ministry, was pointing towards the things that were that he was fulfilling from the old covenant. And so while he was doing this, just looking at our main text, that he was proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. It also says that he was healing every disease and every affliction among the people. He was healing people from diseases, from it says in 23, it kind of sums it up, healing every disease and every affliction among the people. Then it goes into a little more detail there in verse 24, where it says, people with pains, with those who are oppressed by demons, so like demon-possessed people who are having seizures, often the result of being demon-possessed, paralytics, people who are lame in some way. They were all being brought to him. He was healing them. And here again, we have the summary of it. For the sake of time, we won't go through and read all of these, but we have accounts of like detailed examples of these from, if we were to go to Mark chapter 1, we read about the casting out of the unclean spirit. They're kind of late in that chapter. We also read about that in Luke. We read about Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law in Mark chapter 1 as well, just after that unclean spirit account. And then let's go ahead and turn over to Mark chapter 1, and we'll read one of these just for the sake of time here. But in Mark chapter 1, let's look at verses 32 through 34. And Jerry, can you read that for us?
And even when the sun did not set, they brought unto him all that there were diseased in them that was possessed with devil. And all the city was gathered together at the door. And they healed many that were sick from divers disease, and cast many of the devils, suffered not the devil to speak, because they knew him.
Okay, so it's interesting, this account talking about that this, sun is setting at let's see. Yeah, the sun is setting in the city, and it in verse 33 there, it says, and the whole city was gathered together at the door, right? So this word was spreading. The things that he was doing were undeniable, and the word was spreading about this. And these people were all coming to be healed by him, to be cured of these various things. And that's just one example of a kind of an account of these things that are summarized here are in our main text of Matthew. And what would we see kind of the result of the kind of miracles he was doing, the kind of power that he had, that in verse 24 in our main text, it says, so his fame spread throughout all Syria, right? So what he was doing, he was traveling around, but he was also doing these works. Everything that he was doing was to spread this message as wide as he could. And we see that happening here, even in the early days of his ministry. Carl?
John summed it all up. The very last verse in the book of John says that. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself cannot contain the books that are written. And to back up one chapter, the last two verses there, it said, many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life through his name. So, as you said, we've got a few instances.
Mm-hmm.
But there were many, many that weren't recorded. But the reason that we have what we have is so that we can believe that Jesus is Christ.
Yeah, the same reason that they received those healings, right? It wasn't because, often, and we'll talk about this just a little bit. Jesus did feel compassion for people, right? And he would heal them, but that was not the ultimate purpose of the miracles that he was performing, or that the miracles that we read about the apostles performing. We'll look just a little more at that here in a minute, but. So the news was spreading through Decapolis, Judea, beyond the Jordan, basically regions to the south and east of where he was starting. And because of all that, there were these great multitudes of people who were following him. That we read about there in verse 25. The great crowds followed him. And in Mark chapter 1, it says that they came to him from every direction, from every way they were coming to see him. And they came, of course, to be healed by him, right? But Luke 5, verse 15 tells us that they came to hear him as well. They were coming to hear him, to be healed by him. So even then, we know that sometimes people were just following after him because of the miracles he was doing, because of the food that he was providing. But many were also coming to hear him and to learn what he had to say. And the miracles were having their effect of confirming the authority that he had in what he was saying, because he was making some very bold claims, some very unusual ones compared to what they were used to hearing, as we're going to look at in the next chapter. That these signs were very important in furthering that message. Did anybody have any other comments or thoughts on these verses? Chris?
It's interesting to me that Jesus was not doing this for popularity. He already had that. And he wasn't out there trying to just get as many people as he could in the door by using whatever method he needed to get people to come to him. In fact, we can read a little bit later that he had droves of people following him, and he stopped in the midst of them, turned to look at them and said, if anyone wants to be my disciple, he needs to, and then laid out the criteria. He wasn't looking for just getting as many people as he could. He wanted real disciples following him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we kind of see that progression as we're gonna see, like looking through his teaching, that a lot of his teachings were challenging and challenged the way that the religious world even was thinking at that time about what it means to be blessed by God or to be righteous. And right, the miracles fulfilled a specific purpose in that plan to spread that news and spread that word. Right. It wasn't just so he could have a big crowd following. That wasn't his ultimate goal. His ultimate goal was to change hearts. Brittany?
I was going to say that it's interesting that of all the miracles that he could have done that, and he did many different types, but that the healing is something he did over and over again. And I was thinking that it's so powerful. Like if you're an individual and I don't know, you see him, I don't know, do something to nature, like that's amazing. But it's always just a memory to you once it's over. Whereas when you're healed from something, it's like that is part of your life for the rest of your life, and just what a lasting impression that can make.
Mm-hmm.
How powerful that is. So it's interesting, and I also think of the verse that talks about him as our physician and our God is our great physician, and just how, like, when God created humanity, he didn't intend for there to be all of these diseases and sicknesses and pains. And it's almost like this is a foreshadowing of what's to come in the end, when like he really doesn't want these things to be a part of our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that I think his teaching, the miracles that he was doing is it's showing that he does have the power, right? That God has the power to heal, to make whole. I think those are good points. And Jesus was here in the flesh, right? He was experiencing all these horrible things going on around him, all these people that were sick, and we see him being moved by compassion. And I kind of want us to talk about these miracles just a little bit more before we move on into the next chapter. And we look at passages like Matthew chapter 14. Let's go ahead and read. Let's read verse 14 as well. Chuck, could you read Matthew 14:14?
And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick.
All right, and then can you flip over also to chapter 20 of Matthew and read verses 29 through 34? Matthew 20, 29 through the end of the chapter there.
What verse?
29 through the end of the chapter.
Now as they went out of Jericho, a great multitude followed him, and behold, two blind men sitting by the road, when they heard that Jesus was passing by, cried out, saying, Have mercy on us, O Lord, Son of David. When the multitude blamed them, and they should be quiet, they cried out all the more, saying, Have mercy on us, O Lord, Son of David. So Jesus stood still and called them and said, What do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, Lord, that our eyes may be opened. So Jesus had compassion and touched their eyes, and immediately their eyes received sight, and they followed him.
Okay, so just two examples here of where Jesus' compassion, his pity for someone, was key in like the miracles that he was working. Right, that was one reasoning behind some of the miracles that he did. Right, so we know he was doing it to confirm what he was saying, that he did it out of compassion, oftentimes, and also that they were confirmation of prophecy. Right, and this being Matthew, it talks about that when it talks about his miracles of how they were fulfilling prophecy. And just one example of that in Matthew chapter 8. Matthew 8, and Polly, can you read verses 16 and 17 for us?
When evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word, and healed all who were sick, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, He himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses.
Okay, so yes, confirmation of the word was an important role of miracles, right? But another important role was to fulfill prophecy. Right? It's not just all one thing. It's to fulfill prophecy. It was because he took pity on people that he would perform miracles sometimes. And they're all kind of related. They're all part of the reason of why he was doing this and why he would go around performing these signs and healing people and feeding people. Bob?
Back in our original passage, back in Matthew 4:24, it says, and his fame went throughout all of Syria, and they brought him all sick people. And it goes on to say, among the sick people were lunatics, and he healed them. Seems to me like the general population that came out to see him really, really believed in him. You don't bring your brother who's a lunatic out to get cured by somebody that you don't think's going to cure him. You would take him out if you thought they were going to cure him, and that's what they thought, and that's what he did. And all the years I've studied the Bible, I've always read over that word lunatic, and just never really, it's just struck me as being more profound today than in previous accounts.
Right, and not just that, but even think about like paralytics and stuff. Oftentimes they had to be carried by other people, right? Like on their bed, in some kind of chair, or just carrying them. You know, who knows how they, depending on their infirmity, how they had to get out there. Possibly taking a lot of time at great expense as far as the needing help to get out there. And yet they were coming out there. Oftentimes because of the faith they had, right? Of course, there were some who may have just been out there seeking for food or something, but oftentimes we read about Jesus doing a miracle for somebody and healing them. It was because of the faith that they had. And the faith is what made them well through Jesus' healing. Chuck?
You notice these healings were on an individual basis. A lot of times today, you see these faith healers, they'll blanket everybody in the audience that has infirmities, will heal everybody. But these were on an individual basis when they come to Christ.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we know his purpose wasn't to make all followers of his healthy and prosperous. That wasn't his mission. That wasn't the purpose of the miracles. And it wasn't even for personal benefit, right? Even when we read about the apostles doing miracles, right? They didn't just do them to benefit themselves or their friends, right? What did Paul say when Timothy let him know that he had these frequent ailments and these sicknesses? He could have healed them if he wanted to, right? He could have, a miracle was powerful enough to heal whatever ailments that Timothy had. But no, he recommended that he drink a little wine, prescribing something that's very much of the not miraculous, right? To help his friend, his brother in Christ. So it wasn't, the purpose wasn't to remove all these different things from these different ailments from people. Oftentimes that was the start of it. That was again, it could be kind of a shadow of things to come, but that wasn't the primary purpose. It was to confirm God's messengers. In this case, confirming Jesus to be the Son of God, and of course later the apostles and those they laid their hands on. So, and there was an interesting point that was brought up that these authentic miracles that we read about being performed by people, they couldn't be kept secret, right? These were things that people saw. You would see somebody who the town knew was blind from birth or knew wasn't able to walk. And yet it was undeniable what was happening in these miracles. Even the enemies of Jesus had to admit that his miracles were real, that they were convincing. And just one example of that, and I'll just read this quickly in John chapter 11, verse 47. We see the reaction here where the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." Right? We learn a lot from these couple verses here. One is that even they weren't able to deny the signs that were being shown, right? That they admit that they're convincing, and they knew that if they let these things go on, that everyone will believe in him, right? That these were so convincing that they were convinced everyone was going to believe him if they saw these things and heard about these things. But their true motive is, of course, brought out in the end of verse 48 there, where their concern was that the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Right? They were concerned about their own status and their own place in the way the society and their religion was set up at that time. That was their concern, but even yet they weren't here denying the miracles of Jesus. And the same thing was true with the miracles that were performed by the apostles. We see in Acts chapter 4, very similar reaction. And if a person was truly healing today, as Jesus and his apostles did, it would be undeniable, right? It would be all over the place, especially now with the way we have the news set up and easy access to being able to post something or do that. It would be undeniable. And that's not to say that God isn't able to work different things, amazing things in people's lives. I think that's certainly possible for him to do, and that he does that. But the more we study the miracles as they're performed at the hands of Jesus and of the apostles, the easier we can kind of see the contrast between what is sometimes claimed as people performing miracles today and what was actually going on here in this first century. Any other comments on chapter 4 before we move on? Okay. Let's go ahead and look just for the few moments that we have here, looking at Matthew 5. And let's begin by reading the first 12 verses there of Matthew 5. And Chris, can you read that for us?
First 12 verses.
Yeah.
And seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before.
All right, so we have a passage here that I think we're all very familiar with. We're all pretty comfortable with, right? When we read this, is any of it kind of shocking to us? Is anybody uncomfortable with reading this? Probably not. I didn't think I'd see many hands in saying that, because this is often one of the early things you study is when studying the Bible. This is very commonly preached on and written about sermon that Jesus gives. And so I think for today, as Christians, being familiar with that, being familiar with all the other passages we have throughout the Bible, all the other letters that were written, this kind of message of what God looks favorably upon and how he shows that favor to his people is kind of ingrained in us as Christians. We already get it. right? We already get what Christianity means, what his kingdom is, because we have the benefit of everything that we've studied in our lives up to this point. Whereas to many of those that were hearing this time, this would come as quite a shock, the things that he was saying. Right? When we look at the Old Testament, we look at the path of God's people up until this point. How did people know whether somebody was in God's favor or not, or whether somebody was blessed by God?
They were keeping the law. If they were keeping the law, that's how the others knew. They had to know the law. And then,
But what did God's blessings look like to them if they kept the law, if they did what God said? What would the blessing of God look like in the Old Testament? How would you know whether or not you were blessed or whether or not somebody else was blessed?
they were doing good. If they were prospering and living well, weren't sick, stuff like that.
Okay, there would be very physical things that God promised them would happen if they obeyed him, if they did his will. Fight battles for them. He would send rain on their crops. He would do all kinds of things that he promised them in that time in a very physical way. That's how you could tell he would bless people, right? Like think about Lot, right? He was so very blessed, right? God had surrounded him with his hedge. That was part of Satan's accusation against him. Well, he's only following you because you've blessed him so much. Right? And then God said, no, that's not the reason why he follows me. And he allowed Satan to take all those things away from him. And what was did I say Lot? Job. Sorry, Job. Yeah, what am I? Lot. Job, think about what his friends were saying to him. Think about what the understanding was at that time. They were convinced that he had done something wrong because God took away his blessings. Right, that is, and so I want us to kind of look at this in light of that. We'll talk about that more. Chris might touch on it a little. I'll cover some of it, but I'd like us to think about what blessings looked like and meant to people in the Old Testament, and what Jesus is saying, how we can tell whether somebody or not is blessed by God here, and why that would be so challenging. So, appreciate everyone's attention this morning.
Is sugar free?
No, I didn't know.
All right. You ready to make this more? You have plans? Yeah.